A reader lives 1,000 lives before he dies, but the man who never reads lives only one. You guessed it, I love to start with quotes. That way my grandma described it in the Scrabble group chat. I also love to read. I'm not, however, a universal reader. You would never catch me up reading, well, just anything. You would, however, most likely see me reading an epic. The epic is a literary genre that is really, really old. Take the Epic of Gilgamesh. That's one of the oldest written stories of all time. And then there are other kinds of the epic. There's epic horror, like Stephen King's It. Or there's epic science fiction, like Frank Herbert's Dune Saga. Those are all great, but the kind of epic I truly worship is probably the newest iteration in the genre. Meet epic fantasy. A reader lives 1,000 lives before he dies, but the man who never reads lives only one. So says the boy Jojen Reed to Bran Stark, the crippled heir to his family's ancestral castle in George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire, an epic fantasy series of gargantuan proportions that I just finished reading last summer. That's 5 books and 200 pages a day, all in 2-ish months, if you care to try. So let me take you back to the origins of epic fantasy. It began in Oxford, with a professor in literature and the English language. His name was J.R.R. Tolkien. And J.R.R. Tolkien was sat in his study marking a sheaf of papers. In his own words it was, quote, an enormous, very laborious, and unfortunately boring, end quote, process. Picture the scene, the afternoon sunlight slanting through the window, and Tolkien drowsily picking up another paper. Only, to his delight, it was blank. Without thinking, he scribbled the phrase, in a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. This would become the opening line to Tolkien's first published novel, The Hobbit. Now, you would likely tell me that The Hobbit is not an epic. It's a story that most of us have read as children, and I have to agree. But it is the success of The Hobbit and the demand for a sequel that gave us The Lord of the Rings. And The Lord of the Rings is truly a revolution. What makes it so unique is that it is in fact a sequel to another book that Tolkien had not yet written. A sequel to another revolution, so to speak. And it is this prequel to the sequel, pardon the pun, that truly shows what Tolkien was capable of. That book is called The Silmarillion. The world building, the lore, it's beyond epic. It is so epic that we basically don't get any dialogue. But trust me, that can actually be a good thing. The Silmarillion with dialogue would be like reading our school's data protection rights charter. And that can be a challenge, even for a Tolkien fan like me. The Silmarillion is a great example of the rich linguistics of Tolkien's mythology. Sil means light or star, and Maril means ring. And the Silmarillion is literally a light of its own, a beacon to other writers of the epic fantasy genre. Now, the initial revolution always acts as a reference for all future revolutions. One thing that all epic fantasy novels have in common is another sub-level of fantasy. Let me explain. In The Lord of the Rings, the patch of countryside known as the Shire is inhabited by the hobbits, a carefree folk who enjoy good food, ale, and laughter. It is rare for them to be faced with any real problems. Think of Sam, whose sweetheart is the barmaid, Rosie Caution. Of course, Sam gets caught up in a quest that determines the fate of Middle-earth. He joins the Fellowship of the Ring, he kills a giant spider, and he carries Frodo to the summit of Mount Doom. But my point is that Sam returns to the Shire. He returns to his home, And when he does, it's as if he had never left. Rosie is not yet married, and his love is not unreturned. Now compare this to the drama of the mortal man Aragorn and the immortal elf Arwen. She must choose to remain an elf and leave Middle-earth forever, or become immortal and stay with Aragorn. But she would never see her family again. Even in death, they would be separated. Compared to this, life in the Shire really is a different kind of fantasy. However, the wider world often seeps into this sub-level of fantasy. In The Lord of the Rings, orcs scour and burn the Shire, and in Robert Jordan's The Wheel of Time series, monsters shatter the peaceful setting of Emond's Field. In both cases, the inhabitants of this sub-fantasy aren't aware of or believe in the threats of the wider world until their own lives become suddenly upended. And the reader is similarly afflicted. Sooner or later, we must realize that we are only reading, and we are forced to put the book down to resume our everyday tasks. In spite of this, I think we might learn more from this second life that we briefly lived than you might think. You see, this is what sows the seeds for future revolutions. I believe that each one of us is capable of starting a revolution. It is up to us to strive and to aspire. Tolkien began developing made-up languages well before he became a published writer. These then evolved into more complex languages and scripts that we first glimpsed in The Lord of the Rings. I firmly believe that revolution begins at the individual level. And this brings me to my next point, that revolution breeds more revolution, and epic fantasy is no exception. It is cyclical in nature, just like in the Wheel of Time series. 28 years ago, a book would be published in the US that would redefine our notion of the genre. It is a masterpiece, although you might be more familiar with the television series that it inspired. That book is George R.R. Martin's A Game of Thrones. At the time, readers were expecting a different take on Tolkien's tale, but one that still retains the same themes and general aesthetic. Much like The Lord of the Rings and the Wheel of Time series are on the same side of the same coin. An English teacher once told me that all good writers steal, and I have to agree, up to a point. In The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien writes about the misty mountains, but in the Wheel of Time series, Jordan writes about the mountains of mist. Isn't that taking it too far? George R.R. Martin seems to think so. If you pick up any of his novels, you'll see. True, there are fire-breathing dragons and ice zombies, but neither are invincible. They are limited by what their own magic can do. Take A Game of Thrones, a blend of fictional, historical fiction, and epic fantasy. Magic is undoubtedly a defining element for any work of fantasy. But, like Tolkien, George R.R. Martin keeps his magic at a minimum, making the struggles of his characters more plausible. But unlike Tolkien, George R.R. Martin focuses on the ambiguity of the human character, on an internal struggle of good versus evil, as opposed to an external one. There are characters like Melisandre, a fanatical priestess who commits acts of wanton violence for a cause she believes is just and will save humanity. It is this, rather than armies of soldiers in gleaming armor fighting hordes of the Dark Lord's evil and ugly minions, that has once again revolutionized the genre. My point is that it is the differences, not the similarities, that distinguish one revolution from another. And why is that? Well, take a look at epic fantasy. It would be impossible to boil down all the elements of the genre into a single book, or even into a series of books. I love A Song of Ice and Fire as much as, or nearly as much as, The Lord of the Rings. I have them on the same shelf in my room. And that's because they both offer different things. Today, I'm in the mood for the beauty in Tolkien's mythology. But tomorrow I might be in the mood for George R.R. Martin's gritty take on medieval realism, where you can never be sure that your favourite character will make it to the next page. That is what makes epic fantasy so compelling. That is what keeps the genre alive. That is what makes room for future revolutions. Now, you might not necessarily be a fan of epic fantasy, be it in print or on the screen, and that's okay. You see, epic fantasy is just another revolution. It is one of the billions of revolutions that we have encountered since the dawn of time. And it might mean a great deal to you. I know it does to me. Or it might not, which is also fine. But it remains a revolution. And from it, we can learn of other revolutions, of future revolutions yet to come. And not only those in literature. All disciplines begin with a revolution. Epic fantasy began with The Lord of the Rings, which has acted as a template for other writers, be it Robert Jordan or George R.R. Martin. Revolution is a beating heart. It beats once as we get The Lord of the Rings. It beats twice as the Wheel of Time series is published. And it beats thrice as A Game of Thrones hits the shelves. And if you put your hand against your chest, you will feel a smaller heartbeat succeed the first. It is the same for epic fantasy. There are countless other worlds that we, the fans of epic fantasy, cannot wait to discover, overshadowed as they may be by the greats. Because that is the rhythm of revolution.